The warning came 3 days before harvest. Not 2 weeks. Not a month. 3 days. That was what made it easy to ignore. The fields looked perfect. Golden wheat stretching across hundreds of acres. The kind of crop farmers wait all year to see. Heavy heads. Strong stalks. Even growth. From the road. Everything looked ready. And that was exactly why nobody listened to Walter. Especially the new manager. His name was Ethan Brooks. 32 years old. College degree. Agricultural certifications. Computer models. Weather software. Satellite reports. Everything modern farming could offer. And he trusted every bit of it. The farm owner certainly did. That was why Ethan had been hired. The owner wanted efficiency. Data. Modern systems. And Ethan promised all of it. For the first few months, things looked great. Reports improved. Costs dropped. Schedules became tighter. The owner was impressed. The workers weren't so sure. Because there was one thing Ethan never listened to. Experience. Especially Walter's. Walter had worked those fields for 41 years. Long before Ethan arrived. Long before GPS tractors. Long before yield mapping. Long before automated combines. Walter knew every field by name. Every low spot. Every drainage ditch. Every patch of soil. And most importantly, he knew when the land was trying to tell you something. 3 days before harvest, Walter walked the north field alone. Just after sunrise. The air felt strange. Not bad. Not dangerous. Just different. The kind of difference most people miss. Walter stopped near the middle of the field. Bent down. Picked up a handful of soil. Rubbed it between his fingers. Then looked toward the horizon. Clouds. Thin. High. Nothing alarming. But something wasn't right. He kept walking. Stopping every few hundred feet. Checking the crop. Checking the soil. Checking the wind. By the time he reached the far fence line, he had made up his mind. Harvest needed to wait. Not long. Just a few days. 3. Maybe 4. No more than that. The next morning, Walter walked into the operations office. Ethan sat behind a computer. 3 monitors glowing. Charts. Weather forecasts. Yield projections. Numbers everywhere. Walter knocked once. Ethan barely looked up. Morning. Walter nodded. We need to delay harvest. That got Ethan's attention. The manager finally looked up from the screen. Why? Walter stepped closer. The ground's holding moisture. Ethan frowned. No, it isn't. Walter stayed calm. It is. Ethan turned one of the monitors slightly. Weather forecast. 7 days. Clear skies. Minimal rain chances. Perfect harvesting conditions. The data disagrees. Walter looked at the screen. Then back at Ethan. The field doesn't. A small smile appeared on Ethan's face. Not friendly. Dismissive. Walter. That tone alone told him everything. The manager already believed he knew better. I appreciate your experience. Experience. That word always showed up right before somebody ignored it. But we've got satellite moisture readings. Click. Ethan pointed at a graph. Soil sensors. Click. Another chart. Weather modeling. Click. More numbers. Everything says harvest starts Friday. Walter didn't even glance at the screen again. Don't start Friday. Silence. The manager leaned back. And why exactly should I ignore all this? Walter looked out the office window. Toward the fields. Then answered. Because the wheat's telling you it's not ready. Ethan almost laughed. The wheat is telling me? Walter nodded. Yes. The manager shook his head. This is exactly why farming needs modernization. Silence. Because now, it wasn't really about the harvest anymore. It was about pride. And pride is expensive. Walter stood quietly for a moment. Then said, If you harvest Friday. A pause. You're going to lose part of the crop. The manager crossed his arms. Based on what? Walter answered immediately. 41 years. Another silence. Then Ethan looked back at the monitors. Conversation over. Decision made. We harvest Friday. Walter nodded slowly. Not because he agreed. Because he understood. Some lessons only arrive after mistakes. He turned toward the door. Suit yourself. Ethan didn't stop him. Didn't ask another question. Didn't reconsider. Because according to every report in front of him, the old farmer was wrong. And the numbers were right. Outside, Walter stepped into the morning sunlight. The wind moved gently across the wheat. The golden heads swayed together. Like waves. Like they were trying to say something. Walter looked across the field. Then toward the distant tree line. A place he had been watching for days. The birds weren't behaving normally. The insects weren't either. Neither was the soil. Tiny details. Easy to dismiss. Impossible to explain to someone who only trusted screens. Walter took a slow breath. Then walked back toward the equipment shed. Because now, there was nothing left to say. The warning had been given. And 3 days later, the harvest would begin exactly as planned. Unfortunately for Ethan, so would the problem. Friday arrived exactly the way Ethan expected. Clear skies. Light wind. No rain. Perfect. At least that's what the forecast said. Before sunrise, the equipment yard was already alive. Combines warming up. Grain trucks lining up. Workers moving between machines. Everything running on schedule. Exactly the way Ethan liked it. He stood near the operations building holding a tablet. Checking progress. Checking weather. Checking reports. Every screen told the same story. Harvest day. Go. Across the yard. Walter sat quietly on the tailgate of an old pickup. Coffee in one hand. Watching. Not interfering. Not arguing. Just watching. One of the younger workers walked over. You still think it's a bad idea? Walter nodded. Yep. The worker glanced toward the combines. Looks fine to me. Walter looked toward the fields. That's the problem. The worker frowned. What does that mean? Walter took a sip of coffee. Bad harvests usually start on good mornings. The worker didn't understand. But before he could ask another question, the first combine started moving. Then another. Then another. The harvest had officially begun. Across hundreds of acres, machines rolled into the wheat. Massive headers cutting clean rows. Golden grain pouring into tanks. At first, everything looked perfect. The yields were strong. The grain quality reports looked good. Workers were smiling. Even Ethan seemed relaxed. He stood near one of the combines reviewing numbers. Best start we've had all season, he said. Several workers nodded. The numbers supported it. Production was ahead of schedule. Fuel consumption looked great. Moisture readings were acceptable. Everything seemed right. Except Walter wasn't smiling. Around mid-morning, he left the yard. Walked toward the north field. Alone. The same field he had checked earlier that week. The same field Ethan ignored. Walter stopped near a low section of ground. Looked down. Then frowned. Not at the wheat. At the soil. Something was changing. Slowly. Almost invisibly. But changing. Walter knelt. Pressed his hand against the dirt. Cool. Too cool. The surface looked dry. The layer underneath didn't. That bothered him. A lot. Back in the field. The combines kept moving. Cutting acre after acre. Everything still looked successful. Then the wind shifted. Only slightly. Most people didn't notice. Walter did. Immediately. He stood up. Looked west. Far beyond the fields. Toward the horizon. The sky still looked blue. But not the same blue. A thin haze had appeared. Barely visible. Most workers never saw it. Ethan certainly didn't, because he was busy celebrating the numbers. Near noon, the first grain truck arrived at storage. Samples were tested. Reports came back. Good quality. Strong yields. Everything reinforced Ethan's confidence. He even joked about it. Maybe Walter should trust the computers more. Several workers laughed politely. Others didn't, because Walter rarely warned people without reason. And that fact sat quietly in the back of their minds. The afternoon continued. Harvest speed increased. Machines moved deeper into the fields. Thousands of bushels collected. Money being made every minute. Then something happened. Small. Easy to ignore. One combine operator radioed in. Getting some moisture spikes. Ethan checked the dashboard reports. Nothing serious. Keep going. The operator nodded. Harvest continued. 30 minutes later. Another radio call. Different combine. Same issue. Unexpected moisture readings. Again. Ethan checked the data. Still within acceptable limits. Continue harvesting. No delay. No concern. No change. But now Walter was paying very close attention. Because moisture wasn't supposed to be increasing. Not today. Not under these conditions. Not with this forecast. He walked toward the edge of the field. Looked west again. The haze was larger now. Still subtle. Still easy to miss. But it was growing. Walter's expression hardened. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The birds. The insects. The soil. The wind. Every small clue was pointing toward the same thing. Something was coming. Something the forecasts hadn't seen. Back at the operations building, Ethan smiled as another production report arrived. Record pace. Best numbers all season. Exactly what he wanted. Exactly what the owner wanted. Exactly what the computers predicted. And that's what made the next radio call so dangerous. Because this time, the operator's voice sounded different. Concerned. Ethan. Static crackled briefly. Then the operator spoke again. I think you need to see this. The manager looked up immediately. Because for the first time all day, something didn't sound right. And out in the north field, Walter was already moving toward the combines. Because he knew the harvest wasn't improving anymore. It was about to start failing. Ethan left the operations building immediately. The radio was still in his hand. What am I looking at? He asked. No answer came right away. Only static. Then the operator spoke again. The grain. That was all he said. The manager frowned. Because that answer made no sense. The grain had tested fine all morning. Yields were strong. Moisture was acceptable. Everything looked good. So, something about the operator's voice bothered him. So he climbed into his truck and headed toward the north field. Across the farm, the combines continued harvesting. Thousands of dollars worth of crop moving every hour. Workers focused. Machines running. Everything still appeared normal. Until Ethan arrived. The combine operator was already waiting. Standing beside the machine. Holding a handful of wheat. Ethan stepped out. What is it? The operator handed him the grain. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then Ethan noticed it. A slight discoloration. Subtle. But there. He frowned. What caused that? The operator shook his head. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Ethan looked at the wheat again. The grain felt heavier. Damp. Not wet. But wrong. Very wrong. He immediately checked his tablet. Moisture readings. Weather data. Field reports. Everything still showed acceptable conditions. No warning. No alert. Nothing. The numbers insisted everything was fine. Yet the grain in his hand told a different story. And for the first time, Ethan felt uncertainty. Nearby, another combine stopped. Then another. The radios started coming alive. Getting high moisture. Same here. Quality dropping. Seeing damage. One call after another. The manager's confidence started disappearing. Because now, this wasn't isolated. This was spreading. Fast. Across the north field. Walter was already walking toward the affected area. Not running. Not panicking. Just moving with purpose. Like he had expected this. Because he had. Ethan spotted him immediately. The old farmer reached the combine. Picked up a handful of grain. Looked at it. Then nodded. Not surprised. That bothered Ethan more than anything. You knew this would happen. Walter looked at him calmly. Yep. The answer hit harder than expected. Ethan crossed his arms. Then explain it. Walter looked toward the western horizon. The haze was much larger now. No longer subtle. No longer easy to miss. It's not the rain. Ethan frowned. There hasn't been any rain. Walter nodded. I know. Silence. Then he pointed toward the wheat. It's the air. The manager stared at him. The air. Walter bent down. Picked up a wheat stalk. Humidity. Ethan immediately checked his tablet. The readings didn't show dangerous levels. Not yet. Walter continued. The surface dried. He pointed toward the soil. The ground underneath didn't. Then he pointed west. And now the air's trapping it. The manager looked confused. Because the explanation sounded too simple. Too old-fashioned. Yet everything happening around him matched it perfectly. Another radio call interrupted. This time the operator sounded worried. Ethan. Pause. We've got grain damage. Silence. The manager closed his eyes briefly. Because grain damage meant money. Lots of money. The harvest wasn't just slowing anymore. It was losing value. Every minute. Every acre. Every truckload. Walter looked across the field. Then said something Ethan would remember for years. The field started warning us a week ago. Silence. The manager looked at him. How? Walter pointed toward a distant tree line. The birds left early. Then toward the ground. The worms stayed deep. Then toward the wheat. The stalks stopped drying evenly. Ethan stared. Because none of those things appeared on his reports. None of them appeared in satellite data. None of them appeared in weather models. Yet somehow, the old farmer had seen them. Days ago. Another combine radioed in. Then another. Then another. The situation was accelerating. Fast. The north field wasn't the only problem anymore. The same signs were appearing across multiple sections. And suddenly, the record-breaking harvest looked very different. Because now, every decision mattered. Every hour mattered. And Ethan was beginning to realize something terrifying. Walter hadn't been guessing. He had been right. The entire time. The manager looked out across hundreds of acres of wheat. Machines still harvesting. Workers still moving. But now, everything felt different. Because the question was no longer, should we have listened? The question had become, how much is this mistake going to cost? And nobody liked the answer. The answer arrived faster than anyone wanted. And it wasn't small. Within an hour, 3 more combines reported moisture problems. Then 5. Then nearly every machine working the northern half of the farm. The radio never stopped. Quality dropping. Moisture rising. Storage rejected this load. Need instructions. One message after another. Each one worse than the last. Ethan stood in the middle of the field holding his tablet. The same tablet that had given him confidence all week. The same tablet that showed perfect harvesting conditions. The same tablet that never once warned him this would happen. For the first time since taking the job. He wasn't looking at it for answers. He was looking at it because he didn't know what else to do. Nearby, Walter watched the field. Not the screens. Not the reports. The field. Because that's where the real story was happening. The western haze had grown thicker. Not dark enough to scare people. Just heavy enough to trap moisture close to the ground. Exactly what Walter feared. One of the combine operators drove over. His expression said everything. Storage just downgraded another load. Silence. Because everyone knew what that meant. Lower quality. Lower price. Lower profit. The operator shook his head. We're losing money every minute. Ethan immediately looked at the latest reports. The numbers confirmed it. The downgrade wasn't isolated anymore. It was spreading through the harvest. Fast. Workers began gathering near the trucks. Conversations became quieter. More serious. Because farmers understand something better than most people. A crop can look perfect. And still fail. Not completely. But enough. Enough to change an entire season. One worker looked toward Walter. You said we should wait. Walter nodded. 3 or 4 days. The worker stared at the field. Would that have fixed it? Walter looked toward the horizon. The air would have changed. Then toward the wheat. The moisture would have settled. Then toward the trucks. And the grain would have stayed clean. Nobody argued. Because now they were watching the proof happen in real time. Across the farm, truck after truck arrived at storage. And each report looked worse. Not catastrophic. But bad enough. Bad enough to hurt. Bad enough to matter. Back at the operations building, the owner finally called. Ethan answered immediately. How's harvest? The manager hesitated. Too long. The owner noticed instantly. What's wrong? Silence. Then Ethan finally said it. We've got moisture issues. The line went quiet. The owner knew exactly what that meant. How bad? Ethan looked toward the field. Workers standing around. Combines slowing down. Storage reports arriving. Then answered honestly. Worse than we expected. The owner took a breath. Can it be fixed? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Because he already knew. No. Not now. The decision had already been made. 3 days ago. Back when Walter walked into the office. Back when the warning could still change something. The owner spoke again. Who saw it first? Ethan looked across the field. Toward Walter. Standing quietly near the wheat. He did. Silence. The owner understood immediately. Did you listen? That question hit harder than every damaged load. Harder than every moisture report. Harder than every dollar being lost. Because Ethan knew the answer. No. The owner didn't say anything for several seconds. Then finally replied. I'll be there tonight. The call ended. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. The weight of the situation felt heavier now. Because this wasn't just about a failed decision anymore. It was about trust. And trust breaks faster than machinery. As the afternoon continued, the farm started slowing operations. Not stopping completely, but adjusting. Trying to save what could still be saved. Trying to limit the damage. Trying to recover from a mistake that never should have happened. And through all of it, Walter never said, I told you so. Not once. Because experienced farmers know something important. The field always says it eventually. You don't need to. As the sun began dropping lower, Ethan stood alone at the edge of the north field, looking across hundreds of acres. The same acres he thought he understood. The same acres that had just taught him a very expensive lesson. And for the first time, he started wondering if Walter wasn't just seeing the farm differently. Maybe he was listening differently. Maybe the field had been speaking the entire time. And maybe he was the only one who heard it. The farm owner arrived just before sunset. No announcement. No phone call. Just a pickup truck rolling slowly down the gravel road. Dust trailing behind it. Workers noticed immediately. Because owners rarely show up during harvest. Especially not when things are going well. The truck stopped near the operations building. The owner stepped out. Late 60s. Quiet man. The kind who didn't waste words. And right now, he wasn't smiling. He looked across the yard first, then toward the grain trucks, then toward the workers. He could feel it immediately. The atmosphere had changed. Nobody was celebrating anymore. Nobody was talking about record yields. They were talking about damage, losses, mistakes. The owner walked into the operations office. Ethan was already waiting. The tablet sat on the desk. Open. Charts everywhere. Reports everywhere. Numbers everywhere. Yet somehow, none of them were helping. The owner closed the office door behind him, then sat down. Tell me. Ethan took a breath. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the entire harvest, because for the first time, the manager wasn't explaining success. He was explaining failure. Storage downgrades, moisture spikes, reduced grain value, projected losses. One report after another. The owner listened quietly. No interruptions. No anger. Just listening. When Ethan finally finished, the room became silent. The owner looked out the window, toward the fields, then asked one question. When did Walter warn you? Ethan lowered his eyes. 3 days ago. Silence. The owner nodded slowly. What exactly did he say? Ethan remembered every word. Because now, they wouldn't leave his head. He said we should wait. The owner nodded. Anything else? Ethan swallowed. He said we'd lose part of the crop. Another silence. The owner leaned back in his chair, then looked directly at Ethan. And why didn't you listen? That question felt heavier than every report on the desk. Because the answer wasn't technical. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't hidden inside data. It was simple. Too simple. I trusted the reports. The owner nodded. I know. Then he asked another question. Did you trust Walter? Silence. Because now, the answer mattered. And Ethan wasn't sure he liked it. Back outside, Walter sat alone near the equipment shed. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the farm. The harvest crews were slowing down, machines returning one by one. The day was ending. Not the way anyone expected. One of the younger workers walked over. Mind if I sit? Walter nodded. The worker sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Then the worker finally asked, How'd you know? Walter smiled slightly. Not because he enjoyed being right. Because it was a hard question to answer. Know what? The moisture. The harvest. The whole thing. Walter looked toward the fields. The same fields he'd walked for decades. Then answered quietly. I didn't know. The worker frowned. What do you mean? Walter pointed toward the wheat. I paid attention. Silence. Because that sounded too simple. Yet somehow, it made sense. The birds changed first, Walter continued. The worker listened carefully. Then the insects. Then the soil. The wheat followed. He shrugged. The signs were everywhere. The worker looked across the field. He hadn't noticed any of it. Neither had most people, including Ethan. Back inside the office, the owner finally stood up. The conversation was over. At least officially. Before leaving, he stopped at the door, then looked back at Ethan. You know what your biggest mistake was? The manager expected the answer to be moisture, or timing, or harvest strategy. But it wasn't. The owner shook his head. Your mistake wasn't trusting data. Ethan looked confused. Then what was it? The owner opened the door, then said something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. You trusted the data more than the people who understood it. Silence. Then the owner walked out, leaving Ethan alone. With the reports. With the numbers. And with a lesson no software could teach. Outside, the sky had turned orange. The last combines rolled back into the yard. The harvest wasn't finished. But the damage was already done. And for the first time since arriving at the farm, Ethan realized something important. Walter wasn't fighting technology. Walter was seeing what technology missed. And that difference had just cost the farm a fortune. The next morning felt different. Not because the weather had changed. Not because the harvest had improved. Because everyone had learned something. The farm woke up earlier than usual. Workers arrived quietly. Machines started quietly. Conversations stayed quiet. Nobody was talking about record yields anymore. Nobody was talking about schedules. They were talking about what happened. About the warning. About the mistake. About Walter. The sun climbed slowly over the fields. Golden light spread across the wheat. The same wheat that looked perfect 4 days earlier. The same wheat that had fooled almost everyone. Except one person. Walter was already walking the south field. Hands in his jacket pockets. Boots moving slowly through the rows. The way he always had. The way he had for 41 years. Nothing about him looked special. No fancy equipment. No tablet. No reports. Just observation. The farm owner spotted him from a distance. Then started walking toward him. When he got close enough, Walter nodded. The owner nodded back. Neither spoke immediately. Because neither needed to. Finally the owner broke the silence. "You were right." Walter looked across the field. "Doesn't matter now." The owner smiled slightly. That answer sounded exactly like Walter. No celebration. No pride. No victory. Just reality. The owner crossed his arms. "Ethan learned something." Walter nodded. "Good." The owner looked toward the operations building. "He stayed late last night." Walter didn't seem surprised. "He should." The owner laughed quietly. Then both men looked toward the fields again. The harvest would continue. The season would continue. The farm would survive. But some lessons stay longer than a season. Back at the operations office, Ethan sat alone. The same tablet rested on his desk. The same software. The same reports. The same forecasts. Nothing had changed. Except him. For the first time. He wasn't looking for confirmation. He was looking for understanding. He pulled up every report from the previous week. Weather. Moisture. Field conditions. Everything. And suddenly, he noticed something. Not a major error. Not a broken system. Just a tiny inconsistency. A small moisture variation. Easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. Exactly what he had done. The reports weren't wrong. They were incomplete. And that's when it finally clicked. Walter never said the data was useless. Walter said the field disagreed. There was a difference. A huge difference. The manager leaned back in his chair. Thinking. Because the farm hadn't lost money because of technology. It lost money because he treated technology like the only answer. Outside, workers continued preparing for another day. The younger worker who talked with Walter the night before stood near a combine, watching the old farmer walk across the field. Then he noticed something. Walter stopped suddenly, looked toward a drainage ditch, then toward a section of wheat. Only for a few seconds. Then he kept walking. The worker smiled. Because he finally understood. Walter wasn't guessing. He was constantly observing. Every day. Every season. Every year. Tiny details becoming experience. Experience becoming instinct. And instinct becoming knowledge. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Walter near the equipment shed. The old farmer was repairing a small gate hinge. Nothing important. Nothing urgent. Just another job. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan finally said it. "I should have listened." Walter kept working, tightening the bolt. Then nodded once. "Probably." That answer almost made Ethan laugh. Almost. Because it was true. The manager looked out toward the fields. "I thought I knew better." Walter finished tightening the hinge. Then stood up. "That's normal." Ethan frowned. "What is?" Walter wiped his hands with a rag. Thinking you know everything. Silence. Then Walter smiled slightly. The trick is getting over it. For the first time since the harvest started. Ethan smiled too. A real smile. Because the old farmer wasn't trying to embarrass him. Wasn't trying to prove anything. He was teaching. The same way the field teaches. Patiently. Whether you want the lesson or not. As the sun began setting, the farm looked peaceful again. Combines moved slowly across the remaining wheat. Workers finished their shifts. The wind drifted through the fields. And Walter stood at the edge of the farm watching it all. The owner joined him. Together they looked across the land. Then the owner asked one final question. After all these years, Walter glanced over. Yeah. The owner smiled. How do you always know? Walter looked toward the horizon. Toward the fields. Toward the birds. Toward the soil. Toward the crop. Then he answered quietly. I don't. The owner laughed. Walter smiled. Then added. I just listen longer than most people. The wind moved through the wheat. And somehow, that sounded exactly right. Because, in the end, the harvest didn't fail because the farm lacked technology. It failed because someone ignored experience. And sometimes, the most expensive mistake isn't missing a warning. It's deciding the warning doesn't matter. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our YouTube family.